You can roughly locate any community somewhere along a scale running all the way from democracy to despotism. This man makes it his job to study these things.
Well, for one thing, avoid the comfortable idea that the mere form of government can of itself safeguard a nation against despotism.
For big business, despotism was often a useful tool for securing foreign markets and pursuing profits. One of the U.S. Marine Corps' most highly decorated generals, Smedley Darlington Butler, by his own account, helped pacify Mexico for American oil companies, Haiti and Cuba for National City Bank, Nicaragua for the Brown Brothers Brokerage, the Dominican Republic for sugar interests, Honduras for U.S. fruit companies, and China for Standard Oil. General Butler's services were also in demand in the United States itself in the 1930s, as President Franklin Delano Roosevelt sought to relieve the misery of the Depression through public enterprise and tougher regulations on corporate exploitation and misdeeds.
More power to you, President Roosevelt. The entire country's behind you, thrilled with hope and patriotism.
But the country was not entirely behind the populist president. Large parts of the corporate elite despised what Roosevelt's New Deal stood for. And so, in 1934, a group of conspirators sought to involve General Butler in a treasonous plan.
The plan as outlined to me was to form an organization of veterans, to use as a bluff or as a club at least, to intimidate the government.
But the corporate cabal had picked the wrong man. Butler was fed up with being what he called a gangster for capitalism.
I appeared before the Congressional Committee, the highest representation of the American people, under subpoena to tell what I knew of activities which I believe might lead to an attempt to set up a fascist dictatorship. The upshot of the whole thing was that I was supposed to lead an organization of 500,000 men, which would be able to take over the functions of government.
A congressional committee ultimately found evidence of a plot to overthrow Roosevelt. According to Butler, the conspiracy included representatives of some of America's top corporations, including J.P. Morgan, DuPont, and Goodyear Tire.
Thanks to a Senate Munitions Investigating Committee, 1934 to 1936, that examined criminal, war profiteering practices of arms companies during World War I, the public learned that DuPont had led munitions companies in sabotaging a League of Nations disarmament conference in Geneva. The committee's chair, Gerald Nye, said that once the munitions people of the world had made the treaty a satisfactory one to themselves. Colonel Simons of DuPont is reporting that even the State Department realized, in effect, who controlled the nation. The DuPonts fought back against widespread public condemnation that rightly labeled them merchants of death. They claimed that communists were behind the Senate hearings, and blamed the committee for undermining U.S. military power. In response, Chairman Nye, a Republican from North Dakota, pointing out that DuPont had made 6 times as many millions of dollars during World War I than during the preceding 4 years, so naturally Mr. DuPont sees red when he sees these profits attacked by international peace. DuPont's GM and Rockefeller's Standard Oil of New Jersey collaborated with IG Farben, the Nazi chemical cartel, to form Ethyl GmbH. This subsidiary, now called Ethyl Incorporated, built German factories to give the Nazis leaded gas fuel synthetic tetraethyl fuel for their military vehicles, 1936 to 1939. Snell quotes from German records captured during the war, the fact that since the beginning of the war we could produce lead tetraethyl is entirely due to the circumstances that, shortly before, the Americans DuPont, GM and Standard Oil had presented us with the production plants complete with experimental knowledge. Without lead tetraethyl the present method of warfare would be unthinkable. Since World War II, DuPont has continued to be an instrument of U.S. government weapons production. Besides supplying plastics, rubber and textiles to military contractors, it invented various new forms of explosives and rocket propellants, manufactured numerous chemical weapons and was instrumental in building the world's first plutonium production plant for the atomic bomb. it pumped out Agent Orange and napalm, thus destroying millions of lives, livelihoods and whole ecosystems in Southeast Asia. Placing a controlled agent, Anslinger, in the government to eliminate marijuana hemp would have been a small thing compared to other things DuPont did and tried to do to the government. With all that DuPont had planned for the future, and it had to be planned and researched before Anslinger was made head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, there is no way they would have allowed marijuana hemp to gain the spotlight and ruin that. With Rockefeller's oil being used by DuPont to make all the things around us, there is no way he would have allowed marijuana hemp to gain the spotlight either.